Every civilization in history has stood at a crossroads where it had to decide whether it would rise to the challenge of truth and responsibility or collapse into chaos and forgetfulness. Europe is now standing at that very threshold. The question is not whether collapse is possible. It is whether enough people will have the courage to stop it before it becomes inevitable. Ladies and gentlemen, Europe is standing at the edge of a precipice. You can feel it in the uncertainty of its people, in the distrust of its institutions, and in the silence that follows when uncomfortable truths are raised. Civilizations don't collapse overnight. They erode, piece by piece, when their people forget what gave them strength in the first place. The crisis is not merely political. It's not only about economics or immigration or social upheaval. The deeper problem is moral and psychological. A continent that has forgotten its soul cannot sustain itself. When values such as responsibility, discipline, honesty, and faith are dismissed as outdated, what takes their place? Relativism, nihilism, the notion that nothing matters and therefore everything is permissible. That is the path to chaos. If you want to see where collapse begins, look not at the failures of governments, but at the choices of individuals. Collapse begins when men and women trade their responsibilities for comfort, when families weaken under neglect, when communities fail to defend what they know is true because they are afraid of being judged. If you silence yourself out of fear, you participate in the lie, and the lie spreads until it infects the entire structure. Europe has an identity crisis. A person who denies their own past cannot face the future. The same is true for nations. To deny history is to sever the roots that nourish you. A tree without roots cannot stand in a storm, and the storms are gathering. But collapse is not inevitable. The solution begins with the smallest unit, the individual. You must take responsibility for your life. Stop waiting for someone else to fix the world while you let your own house fall into ruin. Put your life in order. Tell the truth. Live as though your choices matter, because they do, and when enough people do this, the tide begins to turn. Strong families, honest communities, disciplined individuals. These are the antidotes to collapse. Courageous speech is the lifeblood of a free society. If Europe remembers this, if it remembers that truth is the only stable foundation for civilization, it can rise again. The choice is simple but profound. Order or chaos, truth or deception, responsibility or collapse. The future of Europe will be decided not by abstract policies, but by whether its people choose to carry the heavy load of meaning and responsibility, or to drop it and watch everything fall apart. The decline of values is one of the most pressing dangers facing Europe today, and it is not a phenomenon that emerges suddenly but rather creeps in slowly, almost imperceptibly, until it becomes the dominant condition of society. Values are not abstract ideals to be discussed in classrooms or admired in museums. They are the living foundation upon which a civilization is built. When people choose to abandon responsibility, discipline, truth, and the traditions that shape their culture, they are effectively removing the very structure that allowed them to thrive in first place. A society that has lost its moral compass is like a ship cut loose from its anchor, drifting at the mercy of the strongest currents, and those currents rarely lead to safe shore. The first symptom of this decline is the rejection of responsibility. Modern discourse often frames responsibility as a burden, something to be shed in the name of personal freedom. But true freedom is impossible without responsibility. Freedom that is disconnected from responsibility becomes license, and license becomes chaos. When individuals refuse to be accountable for their families, their communities, and even their own conduct. The entire fabric of society begins to unravel. Civilization is maintained not by laws written on paper, but by the internal willingness of citizens to uphold order through their own voluntary discipline. Once that discipline is mocked, ignored, or cast aside, collapse is no longer a possibility but an inevitability. Discipline itself has become unfashionable in a culture that prizes comfort above all. The call to discipline demands sacrifice, effort, and perseverance, but these qualities are precisely what keep a society resilient in the face of hardship. When people grow accustomed to constant convenience, when they believe that life owes them ease without struggle, they lose the very capacity to endure difficulties. A culture that raises citizens who cannot handle discomfort will collapse the moment real adversity strikes. Without discipline, both at the personal and collective level, Europe risks raising generations unprepared to meet the demands of survival in a world that will test them relentlessly. The abandonment of truth is another core feature of this decline. Truth has become negotiable, something that bends to personal preference, political agendas, or emotional comfort. Yet truth is not optional. It is the framework of reality, and when a society begins to tolerate lies, even in small matters, those lies accumulate and eventually dictate the structure of thought and action. If people are taught that truth is relative, then justice becomes impossible, because justice depends on truth. A society that no longer believes in truth will inevitably descend into corruption, deception, and authoritarian control. For when truth is no longer the arbiter, power takes its place. Tradition, too, has been cast aside under the banner of progress, but progress without memory is reckless. Traditions are the distilled wisdom of countless generations who struggled, suffered, and discovered ways of living that allowed them to endure. To reject tradition entirely is not to liberate oneself, but to choose ignorance of the very foundations that made prosperity possible. Europe's identity was built on traditions that emphasized meaning, duty, and community. To forget them is to dismantle the scaffolding that holds the structure together. An identity crisis is among the gravest dangers a nation or a continent can face, because without a coherent sense of who it is, it loses the capacity to orient itself toward the future. Identity provides not only a sense of belonging but also a moral compass, a narrative that tells people why their lives matter and what responsibilities they must uphold. When individuals forget who they are, they drift aimlessly, vulnerable to manipulation and despair. The same is true on a collective scale. Europe, in many ways, has begun to distance itself from its historical and cultural roots. And in doing so, it has created a vacuum where meaning and purpose once resided. In that vacuum, ideologies, short-term conveniences, and superficial identities rush in to fill the gap. But they cannot provide the stability or coherence that true cultural identity offers. Nations are not arbitrary creations. They emerge from centuries of shared struggle, victories, tragedies, and achievements. The stories, traditions, and moral codes that arise from this history are what give a people a sense of belonging that transcends individual life. When this sense of continuity is broken, when people are taught to be ashamed of their past rather than to learn from it, the bonds that hold a culture together weaken. Without pride in shared history, there is little motivation to defend the values and institutions that preserve civilization. People who do not know where they came from will not know where they are going, and worse, they will not care. The denial of cultural identity also manifests in confusion about values. When a society forgets its own story, it becomes vulnerable to adopting fragmented and contradictory beliefs. Citizens begin to define themselves not by shared meaning, but by transient fashions, ideological slogans, or consumerist identities. These shallow substitutes provide no real guidance in moments of crisis. They crumble when challenged, leaving people with nothing solid to hold on to. In this state of disorientation, people are far more likely to follow authoritarian voices that promise order or to embrace destructive movements that provide a false sense of belonging. A further danger of this identity crisis is the breakdown of unity. A continent divided against itself, unable to articulate what it stands for, cannot hope to endure external pressures or internal fractures. When cultural confidence erodes, so does social trust, and when trust collapses, cooperation becomes impossible. Citizens withdraw into isolation or tribalism, and national projects disintegrate into competing factions. This is how civilizations disband from within, not through external conquest, but through the slow corrosion of the shared vision that once held them together. At its core, identity is not a luxury, but a necessity for survival. A society cannot navigate the present or shape the future if it rejects the very roots that nourish it. The memory of who we are, what we inherited, and what we must preserve is the foundation on which stability rests. Europe's future depends on whether it chooses to rediscover that memory and affirm the values, history, and meaning that made it possible in the first place. The dangers of nihilism cannot be overstated, because nihilism represents not merely the absence of belief, but the denial that meaning itself exists. When individuals or societies fall into nihilism, they come to view life as empty, purposeless, and without value. And in that state, the very foundations of morality, responsibility, and order begin to erode. Civilization depends upon a shared conviction that life matters, that actions carry weight, and that the pursuit of truth and virtue is worthwhile. Without these convictions, the will to maintain order disintegrates, and chaos inevitably follows. Nihilism creeps into societies not always with loud declarations of despair, but with subtle whispers that suggest values are relative, traditions are arbitrary, and existence itself is devoid of higher significance. Over time, these whispers become the dominant narrative, leaving people hollow and aimless. One of the first consequences of nihilism is despair at the individual level. A person who believes that nothing has meaning is stripped of purpose and robbed of the motivation to strive. Without purpose, discipline has no justification, sacrifice has no reward, and even love is reduced to a temporary arrangement with no deeper significance. People living under the shadow of nihilism often seek to numb the emptiness through distraction, consumption, or addictions, but none of these can resolve the underlying void. The more they chase pleasure to escape the pain of meaninglessness, the more enslaved they become to impulses, and the further they drift from genuine fulfillment. Nihilism also paves the way for destructive ideologies. When a culture no longer believes in enduring truths, it becomes susceptible to radical movements that promise order and belonging at the cost of freedom and reason. History shows repeatedly that when meaning collapses, ideologies rush to fill the void, often bringing with them tyranny, violence, and suffering. People would rather believe in something dangerous than endure the unbearable weight of believing in nothing at all. This is why nihilism is never merely a private matter. Its effects spill outward into politics, economics, and social life. A society without meaning is a society ripe for manipulation. Another grave danger of nihilism is its corrosive effect on morality. If nothing ultimately matters, then concepts like good and evil lose their grounding. Acts of cruelty or dishonesty can be justified as trivial, since in a meaningless universe there is no higher law to appeal to. This erosion of moral conviction undermines trust between people, and without trust, institutions cannot function and communities cannot endure. The idea that meaning is subjective may sound liberating, but in reality, it removes the very guardrails that prevent civilization from disintegrating into chaos. The collapse into nihilism is not inevitable, but it is seductive because it demands nothing of people except surrender. It tempts individuals with the promise that they need not struggle, sacrifice, or discipline themselves, since life is meaningless anyway. Yet that surrender is the path to destruction, because a society that embraces nihilism will lose the will to preserve itself, and when the will to preserve disappears, collapse follows close behind. The burden of responsibility is the cornerstone of any functioning society, and its rejection is one of the most direct causes of cultural and civilizational decline. Responsibility is not something imposed from outside by governments or institutions. It begins within the individual. A person who chooses to carry responsibility gives structure to life, because responsibility forces one to confront reality, to act with discipline, and to strive for something higher than mere convenience. When individuals collectively shirk this burden, the result is a society that waits passively for solutions from leaders or systems, while neglecting the personal duties that form the basis of social order. Collapse begins not when a government fails, but when citizens abandon their own responsibility to keep themselves, their families, and their communities aligned with truth and order. Responsibility gives weight to existence. It anchors people in the recognition that their actions matter not only for themselves, but for everyone who depends on them. Parents who take responsibility raise children with stability and direction. Workers who take responsibility contribute to the prosperity and resilience of their economies. Citizens who accept responsibility protect their communities, preserve traditions, and defend their freedoms. Every link in the chain matters, and when those links weaken, the entire structure falters. The refusal to bear responsibility is often masked by demands for rights and entitlements, but rights without responsibility lead to entitlement without gratitude, and entitlement corrodes the spirit. A society where everyone insists on what they are owed while refusing to ask what they must give is a society set on a trajectory toward collapse. At the individual level, responsibility is what transforms chaos into order. A life without responsibility is empty, fragmented, and unstable. It is responsibility that gives life coherence by forcing a person to commit to paths of action that are meaningful rather than fleeting. Yet modern culture increasingly frames responsibility as oppression, something to be avoided in the pursuit of personal freedom or self-expression. This distortion forgets that true freedom is only possible when a person disciplines themselves enough to act in ways that sustain both their own life and the lives of others. Freedom without responsibility degenerates into chaos, and chaos left unchecked becomes tyranny, as people eventually demand someone else impose order upon them. On a societal scale, responsibility requires courage, because it often demands speaking truth in the face of hostility, working hard without immediate reward, and making sacrifices for the sake of future generations. It is far easier to look away, to expect someone else to solve the problems, or to indulge in distractions rather than confront reality. But this ease is short-lived, and the price of neglect accumulates until it becomes unbearable. History is filled with examples of civilizations that collapsed not because they were defeated from the outside, but because their people abandoned responsibility on the inside. When citizens no longer upheld their duties, their institutions decayed, corruption spread, and enemies seized the opportunity created by internal weakness. Responsibility is heavy, but it is precisely that weight that gives life substance. To reject it is to drift into meaninglessness and dependency. To accept it is to build the foundation of order and resilience that allows societies to survive and flourish across generations. The erosion of family and community is among the clearest signs of cultural decline because these are the basic units of civilization. The places where meaning, discipline, and belonging are first cultivated. A strong family provides stability for children, direction for adults, and continuity for society. It is within the family that individuals first learn responsibility, respect, cooperation, and sacrifice. When the family is weakened, these lessons are not passed down effectively, and entire generations grow up without the tools necessary to sustain a healthy society. The breakdown of the family is not just a private matter. It is a public catastrophe that spreads its effects across every institution. Schools, governments, and economies cannot replace the fundamental role of the family, and when families disintegrate, no amount of external intervention can fully repair the damage. Communities are the larger framework that extends from families, and they function as networks of support, trust, and shared meaning. Communities allow individuals to work together for goals that transcend their private lives, providing both protection and purpose. When communities weaken, people become isolated, and isolation breeds despair. Human beings are not designed to live atomized, detached from one another. Without community, the bonds of trust that hold a society together fray, and cooperation becomes impossible. When people lose their sense of belonging to something larger than themselves, they retreat into selfishness or tribal hostility, both of which undermine collective survival. The erosion of family and community often begins with the dismissal of tradition. Modern culture tends to portray tradition as an obstacle to personal freedom, but tradition embodies the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who discovered through experience what practices sustain life and what practices lead to ruin. When families stop teaching children these traditions, the young are left to navigate existence without guidance, relying instead on temporary fashions or impulsive desires. The absence of rootedness creates insecurity, and insecure individuals are more easily swayed by destructive ideologies or shallow distractions. Another element in this erosion is the pursuit of individual comfort at the expense of communal duty. When people elevate personal gratification above familial and communal obligations, they undermine the very structures that make their lives possible. Parents who prioritize self-indulgence over their children raise a generation that feels abandoned and directionless. Citizens who neglect community involvement weaken the resilience of their towns and cities. The collective result is a culture where loneliness, alienation, and distrust dominate. These psychological conditions then manifest in higher rates of addiction, violence, and despair, further weakening society from within. Strong families and strong communities are not merely social conveniences. They are existential necessities for any civilization that hopes to endure. They teach responsibility, preserve cultural identity, and provide support during inevitable hardships. A society that permits their erosion in the name of comfort, convenience, or misguided notions of progress will soon discover that it has dismantled the very foundation on which survival depends. Courage in speech and action is one of the most vital safeguards against collapse because silence in the face of falsehoods is not neutral. It is an active contribution to decay. Societies are held together by truth, and when truth is denied or suppressed, corruption spreads unchecked. Yet the truth is rarely comfortable, and speaking it often requires one to endure criticism, rejection, or even punishment. For this reason, many people choose silence, convincing themselves that it is safer to remain quiet. But every time truth is left unspoken, lies gain ground, and the collective capacity of a society to distinguish reality from deception weakens. A culture that trains its citizens to remain silent in the face of obvious falsehoods is one that is already unraveling from within. Courage is not recklessness. It does not mean charging blindly into conflict without thought for consequences. Rather, it means the willingness to confront reality directly, even when it is painful, and to express what one knows to be true despite the cost. Societies that flourish are those that cultivate citizens who can think independently, speak honestly, and act according to conscience. Without these qualities, institutions become dominated by opportunists who thrive on deception, and ordinary people adapt by looking away, hoping someone else will do the hard work of standing up. Over time, this pattern creates a culture of cowardice where truth is hidden, lies are normalized, and collapse becomes inevitable. The failure of courage often begins in small ways. A person notices a falsehood in their workplace, but says nothing, believing it is not worth the trouble. A teacher sees ideological distortion in education, but remains silent for fear of losing their position. A citizen witnesses corruption in government but convinces themselves that it is futile to speak up. Each act of silence reinforces the lie and teaches others that it is safer to comply. Eventually, whole populations learn to police themselves, repressing their own voices before anyone else even tries to silence them. This voluntary submission is one of the clearest signs of societal decline because it shows that fear has triumphed over truth. Action, too, requires courage. It is not enough to speak. One must also live in accordance with what is true. Hypocrisy is just as corrosive as silence, for when people speak noble words but act in cowardly ways, they undermine the very truths they claim to uphold. Action rooted in courage demonstrates to others that it is possible to resist falsehoods, and that the price of integrity, while heavy, is worth bearing. Such examples inspire others to take similar stands, and gradually, the tide of cowardice can be reversed. The survival of a society depends on whether its people are willing to speak and act truthfully despite the cost. Without courage, even the best values, traditions, and institutions cannot endure, for they will be eroded by deception and sustained only in name. Courage is the proof of conviction, and without it, truth remains powerless, communities remain silent, and collapse advances unchallenged. Revival through truth, meaning, and responsibility is the only real path by which a declining civilization can pull itself back from collapse. Societies are not sustained merely by wealth, technology, or military strength. They endure because their people remain committed to principles that transcend the present moment. Truth provides the foundation, meaning supplies direction, and responsibility binds individuals to their duties. When these three are neglected, the collapse of order becomes only a matter of time. Yet, if they are rediscovered and embraced, renewal is not only possible but inevitable, because they awaken in individuals the strength to rebuild from the ground up. Truth is the first and most essential pillar. Without truth, no institution can function, no relationship can thrive, and no society can remain free. Lies accumulate like cracks in the foundation of a building, invisible at first but devastating over time. When people learn to tolerate untruths in their personal lives, workplaces, and governments, they weaken their ability to discern reality itself. The revival of a society begins when its citizens refuse to participate in lies, no matter how small, and commit to honesty even when it costs them. A culture that rediscovers truth will also rediscover trust, and trust is the glue that makes cooperation possible on a vast scale. Meaning gives direction to life beyond mere survival. Human beings cannot live on comfort and entertainment alone. They require purpose, a reason to endure suffering and sacrifice. Modern society often promotes shallow substitutes for meaning: consumer goods, digital distractions, ideological slogans. But none of these can sustain the human spirit. Real meaning arises when individuals orient themselves toward goals that are higher than personal gratification, such as building families, serving communities, pursuing wisdom, or contributing to the preservation of culture. When meaning is absent, despair spreads, but when meaning is present, resilience flourishes. A person who knows why they are living can endure almost anything, and a society filled with such people cannot be easily destroyed. Responsibility is the bridge between truth and meaning, because it demands that individuals act upon what they know to be real and what they recognize as worthwhile. It is not enough to acknowledge truth or glimpse meaning. One must also bear the weight of responsibility by living accordingly. Responsibility requires sacrifice, discipline, and perseverance. But these burdens transform people into beings capable of greatness. A society that elevates responsibility instead of entitlement creates citizens who are strong enough to withstand hardship and wise enough to avoid destructive shortcuts. Civilization is nothing more than the accumulated responsibility of millions of individuals who chose to uphold order rather than surrender to chaos. Revival does not come from abstract reforms imposed from above, but from ordinary people embracing truth, seeking meaning, and carrying responsibility in their daily lives. When individuals align themselves with these principles, families strengthen, communities heal, and institutions regain integrity. This process may be slow and costly, but it is the only path by which Europe, or any society, can reverse decline and secure a future worth inheriting. If Europe is to survive, it will not be because governments pass new laws or because institutions suddenly repair themselves. It will be because individuals chose truth over lies, meaning over despair, and responsibility over comfort. The fate of a civilization is written in the daily choices of its people, and the choice before us now is whether to carry that burden with courage or watch everything crumble in silence.